Once you have identified issues that you can research, and after you have become comfortable with your sources, you are finally going to be at the point where you can start putting your argument together as a piece of writing. This week, we will discuss some of the ways that you can structure your argument so that those sources and your points make the strongest impact possible on your audience. Take a look at the following prompt and think of the first thing that comes to mind. Don't worry about pausing the video, just consider the most successful moment of salesmanship you have had, whether it be an actual sale of something or just a time when you were particularly effective at convincing someone else to agree with an idea of yours. Can you think of one? I'm sure you can. We've all had at least some moment that we could say, well, maybe I was a little more convincing here than I have been at other times. But you probably put together a convincing argument because of more than just an ability to identify problems and cite sources effectively. As important as those abilities are, we must also consider the pathos, ethos, Kairos that must go into an argument. I'm sure those terms sound really strange. You're thinking, what did he just say? Gesundheit? So let's go through them one at a time so you can have a good understanding of these three concepts, because those are going to be our focus for our remaining time working with our opinion essays for the remainder of the semester. So let's start with pathos. Pathos is your ability to show effective consideration for the audience's values, beliefs, and viewpoints in your argument. If you have ever been in an argument where you thought the other person was being cruel or too blunt with the argument that they were making, it's probably because that person was doing a poor job of effectively incorporating pathos into his or her argument. So if we want to be effective in using pathos to make our argument more convincing, one of the first concepts to master when it comes to using pathos is to write with sympathy toward your audience instead of hostility. Now, this isn't always easy because it requires you to sometimes bring in viewpoints or information that you feel isn't important. Or it might even require you to acknowledge viewpoints that you consider wrong, or maybe even not matching up with your ethical code. At this point, I want to remind you that the whole point of opinionated writing is to convince someone else of something, and that sometimes means that you need to acknowledge the audience's feelings and the ideas that they feel are important. That way, if you do that, they're less likely to put up that brick wall and become defensive and start looking at the argument as, well, this person they think this and I think that, and it's never going to be resolved. So pathos is a good way to help bring down barriers. And you can show appropriate sympathy by thinking about the perspectives an audience member might have regarding your topic and acknowledging that perspective before moving on to whatever evidence you have that will outweigh the view that you just brought up. So don't feel like you need to just roll over and say, okay, I'm going to give in, here's what you think, and there you go. You want to acknowledge their viewpoint, but ultimately your goal is to make sure that your evidence outweighs whatever considerations they have that might be at odds with what you're trying to prove. So show that sympathy toward your audience, and in addition to being sympathetic toward your audience, it's also a good habit to approach your topic from the perspective that you are there to cooperate with or help the audience. Now, this is actually a helpful skill not only in writing, but in leadership roles, at any job as well. Try to find ways to make your audience's viewpoint feel justified. I'll provide you with an example from my own experience because I think this one's kind of interesting, and this approach really came in handy for me. In the past, before I was making online courses here, I have developed online course materials for other classes, and in one instance I had a coworker who was very upset with some glitches. Now these are glitches that were out of our control, but this person was very upset with some glitches that our computer programs were having. And this coworker was becoming very negative, and he felt that the project was a waste of time and that nothing we were doing was helpful. Of course, I saw it differently. I didn't feel that way. And when I talked to him, rather than just trying to tell him that he was wrong and explain to him why he was wrong, I thanked him for doing such a good job of identifying all the problems we were facing so that I could go back and troubleshoot them easily. I made him feel like he was part of the team. And in many ways he was. So I was able to quickly win over that coworker's trust, and he proved himself to be a very valuable asset in the development of our online courses in the long run anyway. So take the same approach in your argument. If you can find ways to establish common ground and a team mentality with your audience or opposing viewpoint, that's great. If you're trying to make a case for, let's say, increased government presence in something like healthcare, or if you're trying to push for higher tax spending, it's a good idea to first build common ground with your opponent by noting that both of you want the same thing. You want freedom and prosperity for our citizens. So at that point, you're showing the audience that you don't see them as an enemy to be pummeled into submission. Instead, you're inviting them into a dialogue of ideas as an equal in the conversation and as a teammate so that you can come to a good solution for a problem that you've identified. So let's remember to be sympathetic to our audience and also try and establish more of a team or cooperative mentality with your opposing viewpoint. So the next item to consider if we're trying to incorporate effective pathos in our argument is that you should consider what will motivate your audience to feel the same way that you feel about the topic. So consider, what is it that motivates your reader? What are they looking for? What do they want? You may find that if you approach your topic from a unique angle or one that isn't readily apparent to you, you'll be more able to convince your reader to agree with you. For example, as a kid, if I were to try to convince my parents to get a swimming pool at home, I probably wouldn't be very likely to convince them if I just wanted to talk to them about how much fun I was going to have with that pool. So rather than focusing on how much fun I would have with the pool, maybe I could instead approach my argument by bringing up the many health benefits that come from swimming exercises. Or maybe I could note that swimming is a great way to relieve muscle soreness. I've got a dad who's a carpenter, and he comes home with aches and pains all the time. So both of those arguments would be much more appealing than that first approach to my parents. So let's practice with this, with these concepts a little bit, with these three that we've identified for pathos. What I'm going to do is play several commercials for you, and I want you to watch them. And I want you to write down, so go grab a pen and paper if you don't have one handy. I want you to write down who you think the commercial is appealing to. Consider what you see in the commercial that makes the argument especially appealing to that person or a group of people. So here we go.
So your seat good? Get the mirrors all adjusted? You can see everything okay? Just stay off the freeways, all right? I don't want you going out on those yet. Just leave your phone in your purse. I don't want you texting.
Daddy, okay?
Okay. There you go. Be careful.
Thanks, Dad.
Call me, but not while you're driving. We knew this day was coming. That's why we bought a Subaru.
That I could have this moment for life, for life, for life. just feel so alive. 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 I wish that I could have this moment for life. For life. For life. 'Cause in this moment I just feel so alive. 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 This is my moment. I waited all my life. I could tell it's time. It's time. It's time. I wish that I could have this moment for life. For life. For life. 'Cause in this moment I just feel so alive. Alive. For life.
I'm comfortable in jeans that are tough. I'm comfortable in jeans that last. I'm comfortable in Wrangler. Real comfortable.
Wrangler 5-star premium denim jeans. Built tough with long-lasting heavyweight denim. Built comfortable with relaxed fit. Satisfaction guaranteed. Wrangler, real, comfortable jeans.
You could probably see that these commercials are all taking very different approaches because of their different target audiences. The first example, the Subaru commercial, takes an approach that appeals to the interests and sympathies of a loving and concerned parent. They're not advertising to the kids, they're advertising to the people who are more likely to be the ones buying the car. So by focusing on the safety features of the vehicle, the Subaru commercial is able to make an effective argument. Just consider how likely Subaru would have been if they had instead pitched the horsepower and the 0 to 60 time of that vehicle to the same audience. They wouldn't have made nearly as strong of an argument because those are things that would actually deter the audience from wanting to own that car. In the second example, you can see a very different approach. This time, the commercial is advertising to young people, and Pepsi advertises to the younger crowd by appealing to the thirst for excitement that young people tend to have. Note that this is a very different argument than the one made by a very similar competitor, Coca-Cola. Coke often appeals to an older audience by pointing out the long and nostalgic history of their product. So you can see that you can be selling the same thing, and based on the way that you approach your argument, you're going to have a very different effect, and you need to make sure that it's one that is effectively catered to your audience. Now finally, I showed you a Wrangler jeans commercial that was very male-oriented. Wrangler has a long history of selling its products to working-class blue-collar males, and they make an argument for that by showing a bunch of men exerting themselves and roughnecking around outside. So all three examples are brilliantly crafted arguments in many ways because they are so effectively using pathos to appeal to their intended audience. So now that your argument has effectively incorporated pathos, there are still a few more things you need to do. A strong argument should also contain a strong ethos, and that just means proving yourself credible in order to strengthen your argument. And it also, of course, means approaching the argument in an audience-friendly way. So your sources are going to be an excellent support for weaving ethos into your argument. So to use ethos effectively in your argument, one of the things you need to do is approach your topic as one that is not a black and white issue. Because if you have chosen a good topic for your argument, the issue should not be a clear-cut one that is easy to resolve. Otherwise, why would you even bother having an argument about something everyone already knows? So what you need to do is show that you have a well-rounded and balanced understanding of whatever topic you're considering. That's going to help build your credibility. So what we have already discussed in previous videos regarding incorporating opposing viewpoints and creating a balanced argument, setting up a dialogue of ideas, all those are going to be ways that you can establish your credibility and show that you know more than just one side of the story when it comes to your argument. So we'll let all of that speak for itself. And we'll move on. In order to use Ethos effectively, you're also going to need to consider what types of sources your audience will consider most credible, valid, and truthful. This is very important, and it's also something that can be easily overlooked if you are not careful. For example, if I decide to use biblical scripture as the primary support for my argument, but I'm making that argument to someone who is not a Christian, I've made a huge mistake that could cost me the success of my argument. You need to consider who you are writing to and consider what kind of sources that audience is going to find to be strongest and most credible, and then do your best to incorporate those kinds of sources into your argument. Just keep that in mind. It's very important. So again, I think much of what we have covered this semester has already given us a pretty strong understanding of how to incorporate ethos into our argument. So let's move on to our third topic for today, Kairos. Kairos is the timeliness of your argument. You are bringing in the right points at the right time in your argument so that they have the maximum possible effect. Think of it like a battlefield. You've got your infantry units, and you've got your artillery, and you've got your cavalry. You've got to make sure that you send them in at the right times so that they are effective and don't fail in their effort at whatever they're trying to do. It's all about using the right tool at the right time. So this too is going to require that you carefully consider your audience and their stance toward your topic. You need to consider whether you are writing to an audience that is receptive to your message, generally unreceptive, or more neutral toward your topic. So take a look at this chart as a basic outline to help you see some techniques based on the type of audience you're addressing. And I'm going to walk you through these. So first, let's discuss what you're going to do if you're speaking to a receptive audience. Well, if that's the case, you should consider yourself fortunate because you can recognize that you may be speaking to an audience about a subject that they're already knowledgeable about. So you don't have to go into the minute detail about your topic necessarily when you're speaking to someone receptive. Instead, you can cover more in-depth or unique material. You'll be able to provide a more, I don't necessarily want to say more well-researched, but it's definitely going to be one that's covered with more in-depth research because you can kind of glaze over that really basic information. So basically what you're going to do is defend opinions by refuting opposing viewpoints. You don't have to worry as much about that dialogue of ideas, although that's always important to bring up. And your goal might be a little more aggressive. You might not just be trying to get your audience to agree with you, because if they're receptive, they probably already agree. So what would the point be? Instead, you might want to set a goal to get your audience to take action or, push for change regarding whatever your topic is. Now, that's going to be very different if you're speaking to a generally unreceptive audience. Instead of getting to jump right into the in-depth material, you might have to start with small points that the audience is going to agree with, because it's like you need to get your foot in the door. You need to start with some leverage, and you can slowly work toward your main points. So you're taking a more cautious approach, but you still want to make sure you get your good points in there. You just don't want to come out with your most powerful or possibly controversial points immediately, because otherwise an unreceptive audience will be likely to have a defensive reaction and start ignoring you. So get your foot in the door. Be sure to give credit where credit is due in the opposing argument, and always remember to keep that dialogue of ideas going so that you can acknowledge the opposing viewpoint, but then bring in the stronger evidence that outweighs that and shows that your argument is the right one. And you might set a less aggressive goal here by just getting the audience members to at least seriously consider your opinion, or maybe change their perspectives on it. So when you're talking to a neutral audience, I mean, they're not really swayed one way or the other. To me, this is one of the biggest challenges, because you got to take somebody who might not even necessarily be interested in your topic and make them interested. So you got to find a way to get their attention. And a good way to do that is by making the topic seem very important to them. You've got to first show them, hey, there's a reason why you should care about this. And you want to remind them of what the benefits of agreeing with you will be, so that they're more likely to be invested in this viewpoint. So if you can do these things, you're going to be looking at a really good argument. So what we've covered this week is going to be the focus for you for the remainder of this semester as you complete this last and most important essay for the semester. Thanks a bunch.